In the Admiralty records at the National Archives in London, archivists recently identified a bundle of undelivered French letters from the 7 Years' War. They sit today in the ADM 97, a series created to hold correspondence seized from captured ships, detained sailors, and prisoners of war. These letters were never preserved because they were important. They survived because they were intercepted, examined, and then forgotten. What remains is not a complete story, but dozens of interrupted ones. The writers were French civilians and maritime workers. Some wrote from port towns like Dunkirk, Havre, and Honfleur, places where households depended on ships that might not return. Others wrote from inside English prisons. By 1757, Britain held thousands of French sailors as prisoners of war. They were scattered across jails, dockyards, and improvised detention sites near ports like Plymouth and Bristol. They did not know how long they would be held, and they did not know whether exchange would come. They did not know whether letters from home would ever reach them. The letters themselves are remarkably consistent in what they talk about. Again and again, writers ask the same questions. They ask whether earlier letters were received. They apologize for silence they assume must have caused worry. They explain delays they cannot control. One woman reassures her husband that she understands how hard captivity must be, and then immediately insists that he not worry about her, even though she clearly is struggling. Another letter spends several lines explaining that correspondence is unreliable, and that she writes anyways, knowing full well the letter may never arrive. Several writers explicitly acknowledge that letters are often lost, and yet they continue to send them. Writing becomes less about communication and more about persistence. The topic of money appears frequently, and always cautiously. Multiple letters instruct husbands not to attempt to send funds. Not because money is unnecessary, but because sending it is dangerous. The writers worry that letters are opened. They worry that money will be confiscated, and they worry their husbands could be punished for trying to help. One woman makes it clear that she would rather endure hardship at home than see her husband risk trouble in prison. This is not sentimental language. It's practical, intimate decision-making under pressure, the kind of conversations couples have only when circumstances are severe. The letters written from English prisons are especially controlled. Prisoners emphasize patience. They stress faith. They reassure rather than complain. They do not describe conditions, overcrowding, poor food, and illness, even though we know such conditions were common. Instead, hardship is hinted at indirectly. A writer mentions needing strength. Another thanks God for endurance. Several frame their situation as something to be borne quietly. They write as if they expect someone else to read the words, because they almost certainly did. The woman's letters carry emotional weight of waiting. They speak about time passing at home. They mention children growing older. They describe managing households alone. Early letters still imagine reunion. Later letters stop doing that. Dates begin to disappear. Plans are no longer mentioned. One woman reassures her husband that her affection remains unchanged, even as she stops writing about when he might return. Another letter shifts from encouragement to instruction, telling him to preserve his strength and trust that she will endure what must be endured. This is not emotional collapse, it's adaptation to prolonged uncertainty. Throughout the 7 Years' War, prisoners lived with the idea of exchange. In theory, captives could be traded, paroled, or released. In practice, exchange was slow, irregular, and often stalled. For ordinary sailors, captivity could last months or years. This helps explain the evolution of the letters. Early correspondence assumes release, while later letters abandon expectations. Love remains, but anticipation narrows. Experience teaches restraint. Because these letters were never delivered, we never see replies. We do not know who waited longest. We do not know who stopped writing. We do not know which families were reunited or never were. The archives preserves only the act of writing, frozen before the outcome. And these letters mattered because they show how war was lived far from the battlefields. Through missing wages, through censored words, through unanswered questions. They're not heroic documents, they're human ones. And they survive not because they were meant to, but because war prevented them from ever being delivered.